The morning felt heavier than usual, one of those strange, quiet hours where even the birds forget to sing. A thick, low mist had blanketed the countryside of Ottercombe, blurring the edges of fields and fences, swallowing sound and space alike. It wasn't just fog. It felt like a warning. At the White Mare Inn, the fireplace crackled softly. Miss Marple, in her usual armchair with a steaming cup of tea, stared quietly through the lace-curtained window. Just beyond the hedgerows, up on a low hill, stood Moorwood Grange, an aging, ivy-covered mansion, its windows clouded with time, and its roof half-eaten by moss and silence. Locals claimed the manor was cursed, haunted. Some whispered, but in small villages like this, every place carried ghosts of its own. Miss Marple didn't believe in curses. But that morning, something about the air felt unfinished. A sudden knock at the inn's door broke the stillness. Joanna, her niece, went to open it. Standing there in the fog was a man, tall, disoriented, soaked to the skin. His coat was torn at the sleeve, and his hands trembled slightly as if from exhaustion or fear. "My name is Benedict Ashcroft," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "I'm related, distantly, to the people at the Grange. I tried to warn them, but I think it's already too late." Before Joanna could ask what he meant, Benedict collapsed onto the entryway floor. While Joanna rushed to call the village doctor, Miss Marple remained unusually still, her sharp eyes fixed on something in the man's clenched hand. A small, crumpled envelope, worn and yellowed, but sealed tight. On the front, written in shaky handwriting, were the words, "To be opened only if I am silenced." The morning after Benedict Ashcroft's collapse, the mist had thinned, but something heavier still hung in the air. The doctor said he'd suffered from exhaustion and possibly a mild breakdown. He would recover, but slowly. For now, he rested quietly in one of the inn's back rooms. Miss Marple, however, was not one to let silence pass without listening closely. Something about his arrival, about those cryptic words, "I tried to warn them," had already set wheels turning in her mind. Later that day, Lady Evelyn Moorwood reluctantly agreed to allow Miss Marple and Joanna up to the Grange for a short visit. The invitation came stiffly, through a terse note rather than a friendly knock. The manor looked worse up close. Paint peeled from the window frames, the stone steps were chipped, and ivy had begun creeping into the cracks of the outer walls, like nature reclaiming what it had once lent. Inside, the atmosphere was no warmer. The entryway smelled faintly of old wood polish, coal smoke, and something else, like forgotten flowers left too long in water. Lady Evelyn received them in the drawing room, her posture rigid, her eyes heavy with something that might have been exhaustion or something darker. She wore mourning black, though her husband had been dead for several years. She spoke slowly, her voice brittle as dried paper. "Benedict is not well," she said flatly. "He's always had a flair for theatrics. I warned him not to come here with his ideas." Miss Marple nodded politely, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make the room feel colder. He said something about a warning, something being too late. Lady Evelyn did not respond. She lifted her teacup, but didn't drink. Behind her stood a glass-fronted cabinet, locked, but oddly, the small brass key still hung loosely in the lock. It hadn't been turned. Miss Marple noticed these small details the way other women noticed lace patterns. Also strange was the presence of Mrs. Greaves, the housekeeper, quiet, stern, always watching. When she brought in the tea, her eyes lingered too long on the tray, and her hands shook ever so slightly while setting down the cups. Not nerves, not arthritis, something else. As they took their tea, Miss Marple asked lightly, "I do hope Benedict didn't arrive unannounced." Evelyn gave the faintest smile, without warmth. "He sent a letter a week ago. I thought he wouldn't come. He used to be rational, but lately he's been speaking of ghosts." Joanna shifted in her seat. "Ghosts?" Evelyn looked toward the curtained window. "Family ghosts. Regrets. Madness." Outside, the wind picked up, ruffling the lace curtain ever so slightly. And just for a moment, Miss Marple thought she heard a faint noise, like footsteps somewhere above them. As they left the Grange an hour later, the sun slipped behind a bank of clouds, and the manor stood like a shadow at the edge of the world. Miss Marple didn't say a word until they reached the lane. "He may be troubled," she said at last. "But Benedict came here for a reason. That envelope wasn't for drama. It was for protection." Joanna looked over her shoulder. "Do you think they're hiding something in that house?" Miss Marple's smile was faint. "My dear, in houses like that, everyone is hiding something. The trick is knowing what and why." The afternoon light draped itself thinly over the moorland as Miss Marple took her usual walking stick and ventured alone toward the edge of the Grange's property. The locals spoke in hushed tones about the vast grounds beyond the manor, the gnarled trees, the overgrown hedgerows, and especially the lake that shimmered quietly at the far edge of the estate. The place had a way of holding sound. Even the wind seemed reluctant to whistle through those trees. Miss Marple wasn't out for air. She had heard something in Lady Evelyn's voice the day before, a hesitation when the subject of family came up, a slight shift in her gaze when Benedict's name was mentioned. It wasn't fear of madness. It was fear of something being revealed. It was by chance, or so it seemed, that she encountered the gamekeeper that day. Hugh Laban was a grizzled man in his late 60s, with a beard that had long gone silver and a walking gait that suggested more time spent on uneven soil than floorboards. He sat quietly on a stone bench at the edge of the thicket, his dog, a mottled collie, lying silently at his feet. The moment he saw Miss Marple, he nodded, but made no move to speak. She joined him, letting silence linger for a while before she said gently, "Beautiful land, but awfully quiet." He nodded again. "Quiet's the only way it survives. Noise makes people remember." "Remember what?" He didn't answer immediately. Then, after a long breath, he said, "The house hides more than dust and woodworm. It hides what it doesn't want the world to know. And Lady Evelyn knows exactly where it's hidden." Miss Marple turned slightly toward him. "You're speaking of her brother, Andrew?" Laban looked away. "They said he drowned. The lake saw it. But water doesn't lie, miss. And neither do bruises." The words hung in the air like a fog. When she gently asked if he was referring to an accident, he only muttered. He was a good lad, quiet like his father, but he learned something he wasn't meant to. Try to put things right, and you see where that got him. Miss Marple's heartbeat slowed, not with fear, but with quiet certainty. These were no longer the echoes of family rumor. There was something very real buried beneath the soil of Moorwood Grange. She thanked the old man and walked the long route back to the inn. As she approached the village, the mist began to roll in again from the eastern hills. She glanced up toward the manor. The chimneys barely peeked over the gray sheet of fog, like watchtowers swallowed by silence. When she reached her room, she found the envelope still tucked safely in the drawer. "To be opened only if I am silenced," it read. She didn't open it. Not yet. She didn't need to. Not while the house was still speaking in half-truths and ghost stories. She knew now that whatever had happened at the Grange didn't begin with Benedict's arrival. It began the day Andrew Moorwood went under the water, and someone locked the truth in silence. The rain returned that evening, not a storm, but a cold, steady drizzle that flattened the garden and smeared the windows with streaks of gray. Miss Marple had chosen to remain at the White Mare Inn, quietly sipping her tea near the hearth while listening to the fire crackle. Joanna had gone up early, claiming a headache, but in truth, she was unsettled. The whispers in the village had returned, something about how the dead don't stay buried in that house, and once the moor takes someone, it keeps a piece of you. It was near midnight when the door burst open. Lily, one of the junior maids at Moorwood Grange, came rushing in, soaked through and visibly shaking. Her hair was plastered to her face, her apron smeared with dust, and in her hands, clutched tightly to her chest, was a small, leather-bound book. "Please," she stammered, "I didn't mean to steal it. I swear on my life, I just couldn't leave it there." Miss Marple rose calmly. "Sit down, dear. You're safe now. Tell me exactly what you found." Lily's eyes darted toward the door, then back at the book. "I was cleaning the west wing. The part they say no one uses. There's a panel behind the old dresser, loose wood, warped. I wasn't even looking for anything. I just knocked it and it slid. Behind it, I found this." Miss Marple gently took the book from her hands and turned it over. It was cracked, the the spine worn, and the initials AM were faintly carved into the inside cover. The pages smelled faintly of mildew and coal dust, but the ink had held, and so had the story. It was Andrew Morwood's journal. She began reading by the firelight, while Lily sipped a warm cup of tea with trembling fingers. The entries were erratic, emotionally raw, and often scattered, but they painted a vivid picture of life at the Grange in the months before his death. Tense dinners, whispered arguments between Evelyn and Horace, financial strains, threats made in corridors, a mother who grew colder by the day. There were repeated references to a mirror in the blue room, and a cryptic mention of something he discovered, a second will hidden too well for them to find. On one page, barely legible, were the words, "She says the house must stay in our blood, but I don't want its blood on me. I won't be part of this." Miss Marple closed the journal slowly. The embers were dying down, but her mind was lit aflame. "Did anyone see you take this?" she asked Lily gently. The girl shook her head. "No one. I don't think anyone's been in that wing in years. Except, I did hear footsteps. But when I turned, no one was there." Miss Marple nodded. "You were very brave, Lily, and what you've done may change everything." But just as she said this, the clock above the fireplace ticked once, and then fell silent. The next morning, Benedict Ashcroft was gone. The air that morning felt strangely hollow, heavy with that peculiar stillness that comes when something expected does not arrive. The village of Ottercombe had begun to whisper again, this time with unease rather than curiosity. Benedict Ashcroft had vanished without a sound or trace. His room at the White Mare Inn remained just as he'd left it, bed unmade, suitcase untouched, and the only sign of disturbance being a teacup with a faint fingerprint in drying lavender-colored residue. Miss Marple stood quietly in his room that morning, her gaze lingering on the window latch, which showed no signs of being opened. No forced entry, no broken glass, just absence. She said nothing to Joanna, but inwardly she'd already formed a theory, one that led her to send a note to Lady Evelyn Morwood, requesting a second visit. An invitation was reluctantly extended. By the afternoon, Miss Marple stood once again at the foot of Morwood Grange, with its sullen windows and ivy-veiled secrets. The butler, silent as before, led her through dimly lit corridors until they reached the blue room, the room that had been sealed since Andrew's death. The smell hit her first. Not rot, not quite. More like age, stale time, forgotten things. Dust motes floated in the filtered light, and everything was covered in a soft gray veil. At the center of the room stood the mirror. It was enormous, antique, silver-framed, and slightly cracked across the top corner. The glass seemed to pull at the eye, as if it remembered everything it had ever reflected. Miss Marple, who knew better than to indulge in melodrama, still found herself hesitating before stepping closer. She removed a handkerchief from her sleeve and wiped away a line of dust near the center. There, barely visible under the tarnished glass, were fingerprints. Not new, but not old either, smudges from someone recently standing before the mirror. Her eyes scanned the frame. Gilded wood, ornamental designs, and then something odd. A small strip of parchment-colored tape, nearly hidden along the inner edge. She peeled it away gently. Behind it, pressed flat against the wood backing, was a tiny iron key. She tucked it into her palm, expression unreadable. Later, in the drawing room over a forced cup of tea with Lady Evelyn, Miss Marple struck her next blow with quiet grace. This mirror in the blue room, it must have seen so many things. Perhaps even something it wasn't meant to. Lady Evelyn's hand faltered as she poured the tea. A splash of liquid hit the saucer. She didn't answer. Miss Marple set her cup down softly. "I imagine, if Andrew had been hiding anything, he would have placed it somewhere only he had access to. Somewhere symbolic. Something locked." She let her fingers brush the locked cabinet behind Lady Evelyn's chair. The key in her pocket seemed to grow heavier. That night, Miss Marple returned to the inn and stood before her own mirror. Her reflection stared back calmly, but her thoughts were anything but calm. Benedict Ashcroft hadn't run. She was certain of that. He had been silenced, or hidden, but not by Evelyn alone. And now, with a single iron key, the story was beginning to bleed out of the walls. The following morning dawned gray and oddly quiet. The usual hum of village life felt subdued, as if something in the wind was warning those wise enough to listen. Miss Marple, however, never waited for storms to pass. She walked into them with purpose. And that morning, she returned to Moorwood Grange, this time not as a guest, but as an observer. Lady Evelyn was notably absent, claiming illness. Mrs. Greaves, the housekeeper, greeted her instead, stiffly, as always, eyes flicking over Miss Marple like one might watch a ticking clock. There was tension in her stance, something taut just beneath the surface. Miss Marple asked softly if she might take a walk around the grounds. Mrs. Greaves hesitated, then nodded, almost too quickly. The garden behind the house had once been famed throughout the county. Now it was a skeleton of its former self. Rose beds had wilted to tangled roots, hedges were left half-pruned, and ivy had begun its slow siege of the marble fountain in the center. Yet even here, the past had left its fingerprints. Miss Marple wandered through the decay, noticing something that had escaped most eyes. A small, iron gate, mostly hidden behind a thicket of dead honeysuckle. She pushed it open with effort. It groaned like something resentful being woken from sleep, and stepped into what must have once been a private garden. A single stone bench sat beneath a broken arbor. Beneath it, rose stems had blackened from rot. There she found Mrs. Greaves, crouched low, hands deep in the soil. She didn't seem surprised to see Miss Marple. In fact, she didn't look up at all. "I didn't expect company," she said quietly. "This part of the garden's not for guests." Miss Marple walked closer, her voice gentle. "Andrew used to spend time here, didn't he?" A pause. "He did," the housekeeper finally answered. "This was his favorite place. Said it was the only bit of peace left in the house. He planted the roses himself." Miss Marple lowered herself slowly onto the stone bench, watching the older woman closely. "He was planning something before he died, wasn't he?" Mrs. Greaves's shoulders stiffened. "He told you, didn't he? That he wanted to change the will. That he didn't want Evelyn to inherit everything." Mrs. Greaves said nothing, but her fingers paused in the dirt. "He didn't trust her," Miss Marple added, almost in a whisper, "and he knew someone in the house might betray him." At last, Mrs. Greaves looked up. Her face was streaked with soil and something darker, grief that had never had its proper place to settle. "He was frightened," she said, "not just of Evelyn, of what she might do to keep things the way they were. He thought if he made the right arrangements, he could undo the harm, give the Grange to someone who'd use it for good, maybe a school, a charity. But he waited too long." "Because he trusted her?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Greaves shook her head. "Because he didn't want to believe blood could turn against blood." There was a long silence. Then the housekeeper stood, brushing off her skirt. "He hid things in this garden. Letters, sometimes. Drawings. Secrets, maybe. But after he died, it all went quiet." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the arbor. Vines curled tightly around the old wooden beams. Something had once grown here, something beautiful and now forgotten. She stood slowly. As they left the garden, Mrs. Greaves stopped suddenly. "He told me one thing before he died," she said, without turning. "He said, 'If I don't come back from the lake, don't believe the story they tell.'" And with that, she walked away, back into the house that had swallowed so many truths. Miss Marple stood alone in the garden, staring at the twisted branches and the shadows that refused to fade. Somewhere beneath the soil lay more than roots. Somewhere close, the past was beginning to breathe again. The sun broke over Ottercombe with an almost theatrical reluctance that morning. The village stirred beneath a veil of uncertainty. Clouds hung low, and the wind carried the scent of something turning. At the White Mare Inn, Miss Marple sat quietly by the window with her tea, eyes not on the street, but on the past. She had heard enough, seen enough, to know that Andrew Moorwood's death had not been the clean, unfortunate accident the village believed. There had been talk of drowning, of slipping on wet stone, of a fall during a walk by the lake. But now, something else crept into view, something with hands. Later that afternoon, she visited the village clinic under the pretense of checking on Benedict's recovery. Dr. Cleary greeted her with a tight smile, polite but hesitant. Yet Miss Marple, with her practiced softness, led the conversation skillfully. She spoke gently of grief, of weathered histories, of how tragic accidents sometimes hide deeper truths. And then she asked about Andrew. Dr. Cleary was quiet for a long moment. He stood by the cabinet, fingers resting on a file he did not open. There was something odd, he admitted eventually. I told no one. It wasn't my place. Miss Marple waited. I examined the body briefly before the coroner arrived. It was routine. The official story was drowning. He'd fallen into the lake during a storm. That part was consistent. Lungs full of water, water in the stomach. But, she prompted gently. There were bruises, he said, faint but distinct, on the back of his neck, circular, as if someone had gripped him, hard, with both hands. Miss Marple's fingers curled slightly around her teacup. You didn't report it? It was a different time, Miss Marple, he said quietly. There was no appetite for scandal. And truthfully, I don't think they wanted an investigation. Lady Evelyn buried the matter quickly. Said Andrew had been drinking. Said he wandered off into the night. Said he lost his footing. The village accepted it. And he hesitated. I let it lie. Miss Marple gave a soft sigh. But bruises don't lie, doctor. They only wait. That night, she returned to her room and finally did what she had resisted for days. She opened the sealed envelope Benedict Ashcroft had carried. Inside was a single page, yellowed slightly from his grip, the handwriting uneven but urgent. Andrew had changed the will. He didn't want Evelyn to inherit the Grange. He planned to give it to charity, a school for orphan boys. Said the house should serve something good after all its darkness. Evelyn found out. I saw her burn the original. I made a copy. It's hidden. If I vanish, she knows. And if she knows, she may not stop. Miss Marple read the note 3 times. Then she folded it carefully, tucked it back into the envelope, and slipped it into her knitting basket. Outside, the wind picked up and rattled the windows gently. Somewhere out beyond the Grange, the pond remained still, black and silent beneath the trees. But now, in Miss Marple's mind, the reflection had changed. The story they had told, the accident, the drowning, the grief, had fractured, and in the space behind it, something darker glimmered beneath the surface. She knew now that Andrew Morwood had not died alone. Someone had been with him that night, and that someone had ensured he never surfaced again. The storm came without warning, rolling in like a judgment across the moor, thunder pressing its knuckles against the roof of Ottercombe. At the White Mare Inn, the air felt heavy, as though the walls themselves had paused to listen. Benedict Ashcroft had vanished. Not a door unlocked, not a window broken, but his bed unslept, his clothes untouched, and a teacup left cooling by the fireplace. The village stirred with whispers, wondering aloud if the fog had swallowed him like a ghost. But Miss Marple did not believe in vanishing acts. People did not disappear without reason. They were made to disappear, or allowed to. It was on the second morning of his absence that the search party turned up something. Just beyond the edge of a moor, near the overgrown path that led to the old chapel ruins, Benedict was found, half conscious, soaked in cold sweat, his skin pale and lips trembling. He had been dumped beside a twisted thicket of poisonous nightshade, its violet flowers brushing his sleeve like a warning. Fevered and disoriented, he was barely able to speak. But when he did, his voice cracked with fear. She came into the room, in the dark. I didn't see her face. I smelled something sweet, then blackness. Woke up in the mud. Thought I was buried. The doctor was summoned, but Miss Marple remained by Benedict's side. She noticed the welt on his arm, a pinprick. A sedative, no doubt. And his coat, the buttons were misaligned, as though someone else had redressed him hastily. Someone who wanted it to look like nothing had happened. Someone who had dragged him, unconscious, across the moor in the dead of night, and left him to die. Miss Marple said nothing to the villagers, but her mind was already racing. That kind of silence wasn't the work of Evelyn. It was colder, more calculated. Someone who moved unseen within the house. Someone who would do anything to protect it. That afternoon, she walked again to Morwood Grange, requesting a formal tea. Lady Evelyn received her in the drawing-room with practiced calm, her hands pale on the porcelain teapot. You say he's been found. Evelyn asked, voice light as ash. Yes, Miss Marple replied with a smile. And though he was frightened, he remembers quite a lot. Evelyn paused for a heartbeat too long. Then, that man's mind has always been unsteady. So you've said, Miss Marple murmured. Her eyes drifted, not to Evelyn, but to the blue room on the upper floor, the one they claimed hadn't been opened in years. But Miss Marple had seen footprints in the dust by its door. She had seen a candle still warm on the sill. Someone had been watching from that window, and she had found something taped to the back of the cracked mirror in that room, a tiny, rusted iron key. That key had opened the locked cabinet in the drawing room. Inside were old documents, scattered papers, and a sealed envelope of estate letters. But buried beneath them was a photograph, weathered, sun-faded, and creased at the corners. 3 children, Evelyn, Andrew, and a girl Miss Marple did not recognize. The girl stood slightly apart, her hand resting on Andrew's arm, her eyes shy but intelligent. On the back, in faint pencil, someone had written, Evelyn will never understand, but she doesn't have to. Miss Marple turned the photo slowly in her hands. There was someone missing from the family narrative, someone whose presence had been carefully erased. Perhaps the real heir. Perhaps the reason Andrew had tried to change the will. She tucked the photo away. Outside the drawing room window, the storm began to quiet, but inside the house, tension crackled like static in the air. Miss Marple knew now who had tried to silence Benedict. It hadn't been for greed. It had been for loyalty. Devotion warped into violence. Because the past was no longer resting at Moorwood Grange. It was rising. And someone in that house, someone no one suspected, had dragged its bones back into the present. A hush fell over Ottercombe in the days following Benedict's return, an eerie stillness, as though the land itself was holding its breath. The villagers spoke in lowered voices now, casting nervous glances at Moorwood Grange, where shadows moved behind drawn curtains, and strange lights flickered at odd hours. The truth Miss Marple had long suspected was beginning to push its way to the surface, like something waterlogged and rotting. It was time to disturb the final stillness, the past buried under whispered lies, forgotten names, and one body that had never truly rested. Benedict, still pale and weak but clear of mind, sat beside Miss Marple in the inn's parlor. His hands trembled as he poured tea. She told me, he said, voice low. The night before she tried to silence me. Mrs. Greaves. She said Andrew had wanted to give the estate away. To someone not of the blood. She said he had betrayed the family. Betrayed Evelyn. Miss Marple leaned back. And did he? Benedict hesitated. Yes, but it was not betrayal. Not really. It was conscience. That evening, Miss Marple returned to the Grange alone. The fog rolled in thick and silent, pressing against her skirts like damp hands. She made her way toward the garden, past the dead rose beds and crumbling statues, to the edge of the woods, where the pond lay still and black. It was here that Andrew Moorwood had died, 15 years ago. A fall, they had said. A tragic accident. But Miss Marple had long doubted that tale. She was not surprised when she found Dr. Cleary already there, standing at the water's edge as though summoned by guilt. You were the first on the scene, weren't you? She asked gently. Dr. Cleary didn't look at her. He was floating, face down. I knew the moment I saw him. This was no fall. You never reported the bruises. I did. Quietly. To Evelyn. She asked me not to make it official. Said the family had suffered enough. And so you let a murder become a myth. Dr. Cleary's voice broke. I was a coward. No, Miss Marple said. You were a man who mistook silence for mercy. She returned to the inn and opened the last piece of the puzzle, the envelope Benedict had carried across the moors, the one he'd clutched even in unconsciousness. Inside, a single page, aged and creased. Andrew tried to change the will. Evelyn burned it. I saw her. I have a copy. If I vanish, she knows. It was signed with Benedict's name, but more importantly, it was dated. 3 days before his visit to the Grange. He had known the danger. He had come anyway. The final revelation came not in a shout, but a whisper. Mrs. Greaves was summoned to the drawing room the next morning. The constable stood quietly by the hearth. Evelyn, wan and composed, sat in her widow's chair. Miss Marple unfolded the note and placed it gently on the table. "You loved Andrew, didn't you?" she asked the housekeeper. Mrs. Greaves flinched as though slapped. "He was kind," she whispered. "He saw me. No one else ever did. And when he changed the will, you knew it would ruin Evelyn. She couldn't survive that shame. So you did what you thought she couldn't ask. You made it look like an accident. And then, years later, when Benedict threatened to unbury the past, you tried again." Mrs. Greaves began to weep, not with the tears of a villain, but of someone who had long been drowning. "I thought I was protecting them. I thought I was doing what he would have wanted." Evelyn spoke then, for the first time. "I never told her to do it. I didn't know, until it was too late." Miss Marple looked at her with something like pity. "But you let her believe it. And that, Lady Evelyn, is its own kind of guilt." The constable stepped forward. Mrs. Greaves didn't resist. Later that day, the gardener's shed yielded what Miss Marple had suspected all along, a loose floorboard beneath the tool rack. Wrapped in oilcloth, yellowed and brittle, was a second will. Andrew's true intentions, signed and witnessed. He had left Moorwood Grange not to Evelyn, not to the bloodline, but to a children's charity in memory of the war's forgotten sons, those who had died as he had lived, in silence, in service, in sacrifice. Justice, long delayed, had finally arrived, and as the sun set behind the Grange, the name, Andrew Moorwood, seemed to echo across the still water of the pond. No longer a whisper, but a verdict. Morning arrived not with fanfare, but with an uncanny stillness that clung to Ottercombe like the last breath of a long-forgotten dream. Moorwood Grange stood hollow and hushed, no longer defiant, but surrendered, as if the great house itself had finally exhaled. The constable's carriage had come and gone, leaving behind echoes of polished boots on stone and the rattle of iron cuffs. Mrs. Greaves was gone. Evelyn remained, but not as she had been, and Benedict Ashcroft, pale but upright, stood by the parlor window of the White Mare Inn, gazing at the rise where the manor loomed, no longer as a monument, but as a wound finally unstitched. Miss Marple sat quietly at the hearth, her knitting idle, her mind tracing every thread that had woven this dark tapestry. It was over, but endings, she knew, never arrive in tidy shapes. They come ragged, uneven, just like life. She watched Joanna move about the room, preparing to leave for St. Mary Mead, and when the young woman paused to ask, "Will she ever be held accountable?" Miss Marple simply smiled that knowing, sorrowful smile. "She already is, my dear. Regret is its own prison, and Evelyn will never again hear silence without wondering what fills it." That afternoon, the solicitor arrived with news. Andrew Moorwood's original will had been authenticated and legally restored. The estate, once bound by bloodlines and greed, would be sold, and its wealth redirected to the cause Andrew had died fighting for: war orphans and wounded veterans, children like those he had once taught to grow gardens where bombs had fallen. Moorwood Grange, in its final act, would bloom again, but not with roses, with redemption. Evelyn departed without ceremony. No goodbyes, no bitterness, just a single valise and a private train ticket to the continent. It was said she sought refuge in a quiet abbey on the southern coast of France. Others said she vanished entirely. But Miss Marple knew better. Ghosts do not leave. They learn to live with their shame in silence. The Grange was emptied, its velvet curtains drawn back, its locked rooms thrown open. The blue room, once shuttered in memory, stood flooded with sunlight. The cracked mirror had been taken down. The nightshade hedge had been burned. The garden, once dead and overgrown, was turned by village hands and young boys, its soil seeded with wildflowers and herbs, its gates thrown open to laughter. On a quiet afternoon 2 weeks later, Miss Marple stood in her own garden at St. Mary Mead, scissors in hand, clipping back the final rose of summer. Joanna approached, newspaper tucked under her arm, and asked gently, "You've not spoken much of the Grange. It seems the whole village is talking about it." Miss Marple nodded, but didn't look up. "Some stories, my dear, are not told. They're released, like spirits from shuttered windows." She plucked a single rose, thorned and perfect, and studied it for a long moment. "Truth," she said softly, "is like this bloom, fragrant, painful, and only worth holding when one has the patience not to flinch. The breeze stirred, carrying with it no mist this time, only the scent of new blossoms and distant peace. Ottercombe would remember the darkness, but it would no longer be ruled by. Moorwood Grange, once a house of silence and secrets, had finally spoken, and in the speaking had bloomed. Some ghosts vanish with a scream, others with a whisper, but the rarest of all are freed with understanding. And somewhere on the moors, the wind no longer howled. It hummed, peacefully, almost like gratitude.